The morning over the Golden City began the way it had begun for 1,000 mornings before it, with the slow gold of an African sun spilling across the terraces of the palace and the drums of the palace, rolling through the streets like a heartbeat older than the nation itself. Children in painted masks danced between the great pillars of the royal plaza. Elders wove songs praising Bast into the smoke of ceremonial fires. Merchants offered fruit and salt to strangers without asking coin in return, because on this day the kingdom remembered that its wealth had never been merely material. King T'Challa stood upon the high balcony of the palace and watched his people with the quiet gratitude of a man who had spent years teaching his own hands to unclench. The isolation of his ancestors had ended. The world beyond Wakanda's mountains had come to know his nation, and Wakanda, in its measured way, had come to know the world. It was not a perfect peace. Peace never was. But it was chosen, and chosen daily, and that was the closest thing to grace he had ever known. Then he felt it, a cold that had nothing to do with wind, a pressure behind the eyes, a sense that somewhere above the drums and the singing, something vast had turned its face toward his kingdom. He raised his eyes to the sky, and though the sky above the Golden City was clear, he saw at once that the stars behind that daylight were no longer where they belonged. In the observatory upon Mount Bashenga, the astronomers were already whispering. The old ones, who had studied the constellations since boyhood, stared at their instruments with the expressions of men who had just watched a familiar face rearrange itself. Constellations that had guided caravans for centuries were drifting in patterns that no astronomical model permitted. It was as though a hand behind the fabric of space had reached through and begun rewriting the geometry of the heavens. In the deep laboratories beneath the Great Mound, Shuri stood before a lattice of sensors that had never before spoken out of turn. They were speaking now. The Vibranium buried in the roots of the mountain was singing softly, in a frequency her instruments had no name for. It was not a frequency her science had discovered. It was a frequency that seemed to have discovered her. She tried to smile. She was a scientist, and mysteries were her joy. She told her aides with practiced calm that this was almost certainly an extraterrestrial signal, and that they had at last received the greeting Earth had long awaited from the wider universe. She was not wrong. She was only partly right, and partial truths she would soon learn were the cruelest kind. Elsewhere, in the shadowed chambers of the royal necropolis, T'Challa laid the heart-shaped herb upon his tongue and lowered himself into the meditation that had comforted every panther before him. The ancestral plain opened for him as it always did, the purple horizon, the tall grasses, the silhouettes of kings who had loved this land before he had drawn breath. But this time the plain was wrong. The horizon flickered. The grasses bent toward something they could not see. And when Bast came to him, she did not come in the shape of a great panther walking among stars. She came as a woman with fire behind her, standing before a wall of flame that stretched into an endless dark, and her eyes, for the first time in all the visits of his long service, were afraid. She spoke only once. The old darkness has remembered this world. The vision shattered before he could ask what she meant. Far beyond the reach of Earth's telescopes, in a place where the sky itself had been burned into a permanent iron dusk, Darkseid opened his eyes upon his obsidian throne. He had felt it too. He had felt a note strike within the source, a note that resembled the resonance of mother boxes, and yet was older than any box ever forged. A signal that carried the flavor of something living, something ancient, something that should not, by any accounting his science recognized, exist upon a small blue world on the outer arm of an unremarkable galaxy. He tested it against his instruments. He tested it against his memory. And when at last he understood what he was hearing, a smile that had no warmth in it touched the corner of his stone face. He had been patient once about Earth. He would not be patient now. The metal that sang from beneath Wakanda did not merely resist him. It amplified him. It offered the anti-life equation, a scaffolding no Apokolipsian engineer had dared to dream of. He rose. The order was given without words. Above the Golden City, without warning, the sky tore open. A crimson scar unfurled from horizon to horizon, and continents across the earth looked up in silent terror at a wound in the atmosphere they had no science to name. The Dora Milaje ran to their positions. Border tribe defenses hummed to life. Royal Air Guard craft rose in bright arcs from hidden bays. The first parademons fell from the tier not as an army but as measurers, skut, instruments of a colder mind that wished to weigh a kingdom before consuming it. They swarmed briefly, tested the shields, and died against vibranium blades with the ease of moths against fire. And as the last of them fell, a voice slid out of the closing boom tube, calm as poison in water. Tell your king, the true God is coming. By nightfall, Wakanda had become a fortress that no longer resembled the peaceful kingdom of the morning. Every district, from the terraced farms of the River Tribe to the towering markets of the Merchant Guild, moved with the quiet urgency of a nation that had trained for war without ever quite believing it would come. Barricades rose along ceremonial avenues. Vibranium shields hummed over rooftops. Children were taken to the deep shelters beneath the mountains, and their grandmothers, who remembered stories older than the modern city, told them softly that the ancestors were watching, and that fear was permitted so long as it did not become surrender. In the war room beneath the palace, T'Challa stood before a holographic map of his kingdom that flickered with new scars. Each red pulse marked a place where a parademon had touched the earth. Each fading blue arc marked a shield that it held. Okoye stood at his side, spear resting against her shoulder, her face unreadable in the way only she could achieve. Around them, the generals of the border tribe and the commanders of the Royal Air Guard gave their reports in the clipped rhythm of soldiers who had accepted that this night would be long and that many nights would follow. The first battles had gone well, too well. That was what worried Okoye most. She had fought many enemies in her years serving the throne, and every enemy she had ever faced had brought with it a particular flavor. Some were hungry, some were proud, some were desperate. This enemy was none of those things. It was measuring, it was patient. When she watched the footage of a parademon dying against a Dora Milaje blade, she saw its companions adjusting their approach within seconds, learning the angle of the spear, the reach of the wielder, the rhythm of the strike. By the third wave, they were harder to kill. By the fifth, some of them nearly did not die at all. Shuri, in her laboratory, had already seen the same pattern from the other side of the equation. Her monitors showed adaptation curves that no earthly enemy had ever produced. She rebuilt her firing algorithms 3 times in as many hours, and each time she watched them decay within the next skirmish. Whatever intelligence guided these creatures did not merely command them. It rewrote them mid-battle as though the invaders were less a species than a weapon being sharpened in real time. She kept working. She would not allow herself the luxury of despair. But her hands, she noticed, had begun to tremble in a way she did not remember them trembling before. By the middle of the night, the Kimoyo network intercepted its first fragments of Apokolipsian communication. The translation modules Shuri had rushed into service produced only broken phrases, but the phrases were enough. She heard the names of generals passed among static. Steppenwolf, whose voice carried the metallic contempt of a warrior who had ruined 1,000 worlds. Granny Goodness, whose gentleness in speech was somehow more terrifying than the harshness of her peers. Darkseid, whose every syllable seemed to smile. They spoke of Wakanda with the detachment of merchants inspecting cargo. They debated the value of Vibranium, the utility of its citizens as future soldiers, the yield of the Great Mound if properly harvested. They mentioned, more than once, that their master sought something specific beneath the mountain, not the metal itself, something older, something the metal had been placed to conceal. The word they used, when they spoke of Wakanda, was vault. T'Challa listened to the recordings twice. Then he opened a secure channel to the world beyond his borders. He reached for Earth's heroes as a king reaches for kin in a storm, but the storm had already closed the doors. His transmissions bent and looped. Satellites reported strange geometries in the space above the continent, as though the sky over Wakanda had been folded upon itself. Whatever technology Apokolips had used to open the boom tube had also, in the moment of its arrival, sealed the nation off from outside intervention. No help would come by wire. No help would come by wing. If Wakanda was to survive the first night of this invasion, it would survive alone. T'Challa closed the channel. He turned to his generals. He said simply that Wakanda had faced impossible odds before, and that impossibility was only another name for a problem that had not yet found the right solution. His voice did not tremble. It did not need to. His people had followed him through smaller darknesses, and they would follow him through this one. In the deepest chamber of Shuri's laboratory, an event occurred that no one in the war room yet knew of. A captured Paredeman, held in a Vibranium containment field, refused to submit to her reprogramming attempts. The creature should have been a simple matter of firmware. Instead, when Shuri pressed her palm to the field, a fragment of consciousness leaked through the barrier and into her mind. It lasted less than a second. It contained a lifetime. She saw the being who had been the Paredeman before Apokolips claimed it. She saw a mother on a green world she could not name. She saw a name in a language she could not read. She saw the moment of stripping, when everything that being had been was pulled from it like thread from a garment, until only the weapon remained. Shuri stepped back from the containment field and did not speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was quieter than any of her aides had ever heard it. She said that they had been fighting slaves, that every Paredeman they had killed had been someone's child once, someone's love, someone's ordinary joy. And she said, with the beginning of an anger she had not yet learned to name, that the beings who did this to living souls could not merely be defeated. They had to be answered for. Above Wakanda, the sky began all at once to burn. The heavens above Wakanda opened in a manner that no astronomer, no myth, no prophet had ever imagined. Where a single boom tube had torn the sky the previous day, now 1,000 blooms of crimson light unfurled at once, and then 10,000, and then a number the eye could not honestly count. The Golden City looked up into a false dawn made of fire, and in that terrible glow the first wave of the true invasion began its descent. Paredemans fell like locusts made of metal and hunger. Above them came the war craft of Apokolips, jagged black shapes that dragged their own weight of dread across the sky. Beyond even those, from the deepest tiers in the atmosphere, came the great harvesters, machines the size of small mountains that hung above the horizon and unfurled cannons designed to strip planets to their bones. It was an armada assembled to end civilizations, and it had been assembled to end this one, yet Wakanda answered. The shields rose first, a lattice of vibranium and light that closed over the Golden City like the palm of a great hand. Border tribe warriors on their armored beasts thundered from the outer settlements to reinforce the walls, their blue capes flaring behind them like the banners of an older era. The Dora Milaje took their positions along the ceremonial ramparts, each woman a red column of discipline. Royal Air Guard Talon craft rose in tight formation, their pilots singing the old songs into their comms so that no one on any frequency would forget who was fighting and why. T'Challa did not fight from the front. He had fought from the front many times, and he had learned in the harder years of his kingship that a king who spent himself in the first hour was a king who abandoned his people in the 10th. Instead, he stood in the war room and he commanded, and his commands were not the commands of a man who intended to trade lives for time. He collapsed a mountain pass to swallow a Paredeman column whole. He ordered a set of decoy shield generators to blaze at full power on the far side of the plateau, drawing an apocalyptic bombardment onto empty ground. He directed Shuri to weaponize the very instability of the boom tubes, turning their opening arcs against the craft that came through them, so that ships arriving in triumph were shredded by the geometry of their own doorways. For a full day and a full night, Wakanda held. More than held. Wakanda taught. In war rooms far above the atmosphere, apocalyptic tacticians watched the resistance below with expressions that shifted slowly from contempt to attention. Steppenwolf himself, who had walked worlds in ash without breaking stride, paused in his pacing and admitted, in a voice only Darkseid heard, that this small kingdom fought as though it had been preparing for him personally. Darkseid noted the compliment. He did not repeat it. Within the city, small mercies bloomed alongside great sacrifices. A young Dora Milaje recruit, bleeding from a wound she refused to acknowledge, held a plaza gate long enough for 3 families to reach the shelters. A border tribe elder, too old to fight, sang the death rites over the fallen so that no warrior of Wakanda would enter the ancestral plane without being named. A merchant guild clerk whose hands had never held a weapon learned in a single afternoon how to operate a shield generator and refused to leave her post even when her building burned around her. These were the moments the enemy did not understand. The Apokolipsians measured strength and yield in output in the tonnage of destruction a unit could deliver. They did not measure the strength of a grandmother who sang the dead into the next world while war shook the walls around her. They had never learned that such a strength existed. It was, perhaps, the one lesson they had never conquered. Beneath the Great Mound, however, another war was being waged in silence, and this one Wakanda did not know it was losing. An Apokolipsian excavation team deployed during the chaos of the first siege had bypassed the outer defenses through a boom tube tuned so precisely that even Shuri's sensors had registered it only as a tremor. They drilled downward through geological layers older than the human species, and they did not drill blindly. They drilled with the certainty of beings who had been given coordinates 100,000 years old. They found what they had come to find. Deep beneath the mountain, in a chamber that no Wakandan hand had ever opened, they uncovered a wall of inscriptions. The symbols carved into that wall were older than language as any surface civilization understood it. They spiraled and interlocked in patterns that hurt the eye. And when the lead excavator, a hollow-eyed servant of Darkseid, took a scan of the wall and transmitted it to Apokolips, the response from the throne came within a heartbeat. Darkseid himself rose from his obsidian seat. The symbols on the wall beneath Wakanda were identical in every stroke to symbols carved into the deepest foundations of Apokolips. They were the same alphabet, written by the same hand, and that hand had not belonged to Darkseid, nor to his father, nor to any tyrant of his line. It had belonged to something that predated the very gods of the New World. Darkseid smiled, and in that smile there was no triumph. There was only recognition. He had suspected. Now he knew. Above the Golden City, the last wave of the first siege began to break against Wakandan lines. Cheers rose along the ramparts as the enemy fell back in confusion. T'Challa allowed his generals their moment of relief. He did not join it. He had felt, somewhere beneath his ribs, the tremor of a wall opening in the deep. And then, without warning, the sky above the Great Mound tore itself open one final time. And from the widest boom tube any Wakandan I had ever seen, Darkseid stepped through onto the surface of the earth. The war did not pause when Darkseid set foot upon Wakandan soil. It only quieted, the way a room quiets when a truth too large for it has entered. He did not move toward the Golden City. He did not fire upon the shields. He merely stood upon a ridge overlooking the ruined plateau, and the war craft above him hovered in disciplined silence, and even his own generals kept their distance, because they had learned across long centuries that Darkseid, when patient, was Darkseid at his most dangerous. T'Challa understood this at once. He ordered no counterattack. He ordered instead that every scholar, every archivist, every priest of the Panther cult still living within the walls of the royal necropolis be summoned to the palace. Whatever Darkseid had come to claim, T'Challa intended to reach it first and to understand it, and if necessary to end it. Shuri met him at the entrance to the deep chambers, her face pale from something she had already seen. She had traced the coordinates of the Apokolipsian excavation. She had followed them downward through the geological survey of the mountain. She had discovered, to her quiet horror, that a chamber existed beneath the Great Mound whose entrance did not appear on any Wakandan map, and whose existence had somehow escaped the notice of every generation of Panthers who had walked above it. Together, brother and sister descended. The lift carried them past the layers of history that Wakanda knew and loved, past the training halls of the Dora Milaje, past the archives of the astronomers, past the vaults of the Vibranium refiners, past the ossuaries of ancient kings, and then past all of these into a shaft that had not been dug by any Wakandan hand, and whose walls were smooth in a way that spoke of an age when the mountain itself had been softer than stone. At the bottom, they found the mural. It stretched across a chamber wider than the palace throne room. Its surface was not paint, it was not carving. It was something between the two, an art that seemed to have been pressed into the wall by the pressure of its own meaning. And upon that wall, in figures taller than men, the story of Wakanda before Wakanda unfolded. They saw the first images. Celestial beings, tall and radiant, gathering above a young earth, they saw an object in their hands, a fragment of something torn from a greater whole, a shard of a truth so vast that even in mural form it seemed to hurt the mountain around it. They saw the beings burying the shard within the mountain, and they saw a great cat, black and gold, coiled protectively around the burial. They saw the birth of a covenant, older than language, older than tribe, older than the name Wakanda itself. Shuri, who had spent her life believing that science and myth were separate rooms in a single house, saw at last that the walls between the rooms had never truly been walls. She traced the mural with her fingers and did not speak, because speaking would have required her to acknowledge that everything she had ever built her nation upon was true in a way she had not been prepared to accept. T'Challa was quieter still. He recognized the great cat in the mural. He recognized her as Bast, and he understood now why the goddess had been afraid. The shard the Celestials had buried was not a weapon. It was worse than a weapon. It was, according to the images that followed, a piece of an equation. An equation that, when spoken in full, would end the freedom of every conscious being in the universe. Anti-life. A truth so pure and so terrible that even its custodians had chosen to break it into fragments and hide those fragments across creation, entrusting each to a guardian sworn to die rather than yield. Wakanda had been such a guardian. Vibranium had been the seal, and Bast had been the promise that the seal would hold. Darkseid then had not been searching blindly. He had remembered. Somewhere in the long centuries of his tyranny, he had recovered an echo of the ancient covenant, and he had come to Earth not as a conqueror discovering a new resource, but as a thief returning to a vault whose location he had never truly forgotten. Word of the mural spread quickly among Wakanda's elders, and with the word came division. The council chamber, which had for years been a place of measured debate, filled that evening with voices that shook the rafters. Some elders argued that the fragment must remain buried, that Wakanda's duty was the same duty it had always carried, and that no invader, however godlike, could be permitted to reach it. Others argued that the fragment had already been found, that its concealment had failed, and that the only true safeguard now was its destruction. Still others, in quieter tones, wondered aloud whether Bast herself had ever truly served the interests of Wakanda, or whether the goddess had used their kingdom as a convenient tomb for a thing she should have destroyed at its making. T'Challa listened to all of them. He did not interrupt. A king who did not permit his people their anger, he had long ago learned, was a king who ruled corpses. While the council raged, Darkseid did what Darkseid always did. He waited, and while he waited, he spoke. His voice began to reach the citizens of Wakanda not through radio, not through the Kimoyo network, but through the meditations of every mind that grew tired enough to lower its guard. Farmers in shelters heard him in the moments before sleep. Warriors on the walls heard him between breaths. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He offered, in the calm tone of a physician diagnosing a fever, an end to suffering, an end to choice, which he called the disease behind all suffering. He promised order without cruelty, unity without division, peace without struggle. And though no Wakandan surrendered to his voice, more than one closed their eyes and, for a single guilty moment, wondered whether he might be right. In the ancestral plain that night, T'Challa knelt before Bast. She did not speak. She only wept, and her tears fell as fire onto ground that could not burn. And T'Challa understood at last that her silence had never been abandonment. It had always been sorrow. Darkseid moved on the morning of the fourth day, and when he moved, the sky above Wakanda changed color. It was not the crimson of the boom tubes anymore. It was a deeper red, older than fire, the shade of a wound that had never learned to close. His warcraft came forward in a single vast wedge, and beneath their shadow the plateau that surrounded the Golden City turned dark as though the sun had refused to look upon what was about to occur. He walked ahead of his own armies. That, more than anything, told T'Challa the true measure of the enemy he faced. Warlords sent their soldiers first. Emperors sent their generals. Only a god walked ahead of his own legions, and only a god did so without haste, because only a god had learned that time itself was one of his weapons. The first Omega beams cut across Wakanda's outer shields at mid-morning. They did not strike as lightning strikes. They tracked. They bent through the air like the gaze of a hunter searching for a hidden face, and when they found their targets, they did not merely destroy them. They erased them so that the space where a shield tower had stood became a space where the concept of a shield tower had never been permitted to exist. Wakandan soldiers who saw the beams and lived remembered them not as light but as absence, a slice of not being drawn across the world with a hand that did not tremble. The outer defenses collapsed within an hour. Steppenwolf led the ground assault. He came with a legion of his own choosing, elites whose armor was black as the throat of a well, whose axes had ended kings in 100 galaxies. He did not roar. He did not boast. He walked forward through the smoking ruins of the outer wall with the calm Tao, exhaustion of a butcher who had done this work too many times to still feel excitement. The Dora Milaje met him at the second wall, and there they made him remember what real resistance felt like. Okoye herself broke his advance 3 times in a single afternoon, driving her spear through the joint of his armor with a precision that would be sung about in the war songs of every surviving tribe for 100 years. He bled. He had not bled on many worlds. It did not stop him, but it slowed him, and slowing him was the closest thing to victory that the walls of Wakanda would offer that day. Behind him, however, other forces moved. Granny Goodness reached the districts of the Merchant Guild through a boom tube tuned to the alleys behind the market. Her female furies moved through the streets not as soldiers but as gardeners, pruning defenders from doorways with a domestic patience that was worse than any battle cry. Whole neighborhoods that had rung with festival drums 4 days earlier fell silent that afternoon in a way that had nothing to do with peace. Darkseid, meanwhile, worked below. The Great Mound had begun to fracture. Every impact of an Omega beam upon its surface sent tremors through its interior, and the ancient Vibranium locks that had held the deep chamber closed for 100,000 years began, one by one, to fail. Storms of raw Vibranium energy leaked from the fractures, twisting the air around the mountain into unnatural shapes. Warriors on the outer slopes found themselves fighting men who had not been born yet and enemies who had died decades before, as the fabric of local time snipped its rivets under the strain. Shuri fought her way to the excavation site with a squad of the finest engineers Wakanda had ever trained. She did not intend to reach the fragment. She intended to seal it, to bury it deeper, to destroy the very access that Darkseid's forces had opened. She almost succeeded. She had already primed the collapse charges, already begun the retreat sequence, when a squad of parademons breached the outer chamber and pinned her team against a wall of ancient stone. She fought with the ferocity of a woman who understood, at last, what she was defending. She emptied her wrist gauntlets into the swarm. She improvised a vibranium pulse from a fallen sensor node. She held the line long enough for 2 of her engineers to escape. But when the female furies arrived behind the parademons, and when Granny Goodness herself stepped through the smoke with a smile that had no kindness in it, Shuri understood that she would not be leaving that chamber on her own terms. She detonated the charges anyway. She sealed the outer passage. She trusted her brother to understand why. Then she allowed herself to be taken because she carried within her mind 100 defenses she would not permit to fall into any other hand. T'Challa learned of her capture from a broken transmission that ended in static. He did not speak for a full minute. Okoye, standing beside him, watched his face and understood that a private grief had just entered a public war. When at last he spoke, his voice was steadier than she had feared. He said only that his sister was worth more than any fragment, and that he would remember this, and that Darkseid would remember it too. By evening, the Golden City had lost its outer districts. By nightfall, it had lost its second wall. By the deepest hour of the night, when even the stars seemed reluctant to shine upon what was happening below, the Great Mound cracked at its summit, and a plume of white and violet fire rose from its center high enough to be seen from orbit. Darkseid climbed the ruined slope alone. He did not need an escort. His generals had cleared the path, and what remained of Wakanda's defenders on that mountain were too few, too wounded, and too far from reinforcements to prevent his ascent. He walked with the slow inevitability of gravity itself, and when he reached the summit, he stood atop the shattered Great Mound and looked down upon a city that had been beautiful only that morning. He raised one great gray hand. The fragment of anti-life, freed at last from its ancient seal, rose from the deep and drifted toward him in a slow, obedient arc. Hope, in that hour, had never seemed more absent from the world. The survivors gathered where survivors have always gathered, in the places the enemy had not yet thought to look. They came from the shattered districts of the Golden City with soot in their hair and children on their backs. They came from the border settlements along the mountain paths with their armored beasts limping beside them. They came from the river tribe villages by canoe under the cover of the mist, and from the mining tribe caves by tunnels no map had ever recorded. They came, most of them, without speaking, because grief that fresh has no language yet, and the songs would come later or not at all. T'Challa met them in a wide valley south of the ruined capital, a place the ancestors had once used for the great gatherings before Wakanda had been a nation with walls. He had chosen it deliberately. He wanted his people to remember in this hour that they had been a people before they had been a kingdom, and that a kingdom, however golden, was only ever a form the people had chosen to wear. He walked among them. He did not sit above them. He knelt beside a wounded Dora Milaje who had lost 2 comrades that morning, and he pressed his forehead briefly to hers. And he spoke her name aloud so that everyone within earshot would know that even in ruin their king remembered them by name. He embraced border tribe warriors who had once opposed his rule. He accepted, without flinching, the anger of a mining tribe elder who had lost 3 grandchildren beneath a collapsed shelter. He accepted also the offered spears of 2 Jabari warriors who had come down from their mountains for the first time in generations, because they had decided, in their own council, that some fights outranked their isolation. M'Baku himself stood at the edge of the gathering, arms folded, eyes bright with a fury he did not attempt to hide. When T'Challa reached him at last, the 2 men regarded one another for a long, silent moment. Then M'Baku said in his low, steady voice that the Jabari had come not because they loved Wakanda's throne, but because they loved Wakanda's people, and that the difference between the 2 mattered less than it had a week ago. T'Challa accepted the correction without argument. It was, in its way, the truest oath he had ever received. That night, alone in the ruined stones of a panther shrine that had somehow survived the bombardment, T'Challa took the last of the heart-shaped herb he carried and lowered himself once more into the ancestral plane. He did not know if it would answer. The Great Mound had cracked. The bond between the living panthers and the ancestors had frayed in ways his priests could not measure. He might, he thought, be walking into silence. The plane opened, but it opened wrong. The tall grass was gray. The purple sky flickered. The silhouettes of the kings who had preceded him stood at the edge of the horizon, but they did not approach. They watched, and their watching was itself a kind of message. This was not their fight to counsel. This fight belonged to him alone. Bast came to him at last, and she was no longer the fearful figure he had seen days before. She had grown quiet, old. She looked at him with the expression of a mother preparing to ask her son to do a thing she wished, with all her heart, that she could do herself. She told him the truth she had withheld. The fragment could not be destroyed by force. No blade, no cannon, no bomb of any make would sever what the Celestials had bound. It could be destroyed only by being channeled through a soul willing to burn with it. A soul capable of holding, for a single blazing moment, the entire weight of the anti-life truth and refusing it in the same breath. And the only conduit strong enough to root that weight safely away from the world was the ancestral bond itself, the same bond that had made every panther more than a man. To destroy the fragment, T'Challa would have to sever the connection between Wakanda's kings and Wakanda's ancestors. The line of the panther, unbroken since before the first written word, would end with him. There would be no more visions in the purple grass, no more counsel from the fathers who had gone before, no more Bast walking beside her chosen. The goddess herself would fade from the world. She did not ask him if he was willing. She only asked him if he understood. He said that he did. She placed her hand upon his brow, and for a long moment there was no queen and no king in the plain. Only 2 beings who had loved a small kingdom in a large universe, and who were preparing to give it up in order to save it. When he returned to the waking world, Shuri was there. She had escaped. He did not ask how at first. He only held her, and for a moment the war outside their tent did not exist. When at last she stepped back, her eyes were harder than he remembered and older, and she carried in the sleeve of her tunic a data crystal she had stolen from Darkseid himself during her captivity. Upon it were the schematics of the harvesters, the frequencies of the boom tubes, the command protocols that bound the parademons to their masters. She had used her captivity in the manner only Shuri could, as a research expedition, she told him quietly, that she believed she could free the parademons. Not all of them, not at once, but enough of them in the right moment to matter. He looked at her. He saw not only his sister, but the woman she had become in a week of horrors. And he understood that Wakanda had, without knowing it, been raising more than one panther all along. That morning the united forces marched, Wakandans and Jabari, river tribe and border tribe, merchant clerks and mining engineers, Dora Milaje and volunteers who had never held a spear before that week. They marched not toward victory, because victory was no longer certain, but toward the ruined capital, because it was the last place their king intended to stand. And they had decided that wherever he stood, they would stand also. Above them, the sky burned. Ahead of them, Darkseid waited. The final battle did not begin with a charge. It began with a silence so complete that even the wind seemed unwilling to enter it. The united army halted upon the crest of the last ridge before the ruined city, and across the shattered plateau, the legions of Apokolips arranged themselves in the disciplined stillness of a machine preparing to move. Between the two forces stretched the broken ground of what had once been the ceremonial approach to the Golden City. Now it was ash and slag and the small, terrible objects that battlefields always leave behind. At the center of that ash stood Darkseid. He did not need an army beside him. He carried the fragment in his palm as easily as a man might carry a coin, and the fragment pulsed with a light that hurt the eyes of anyone brave enough to look upon it directly. He was not smiling. Darkseid did not smile at moments like this. He wore instead the expression of a mathematician who had finally reached the final line of a proof he had been working upon for 100,000 years. T'Challa stepped forward from the line of his people. He wore the panther habit for what he understood might be the last time. Around him, the united forces formed their ranks. Okoye and the surviving Dora Milaje in a red arc to his right, M'Baku and the Jabari in a wall of muscle and spear to his left. Shuri behind him, her hands already moving across a Kimoyo array that trembled with the code she had stolen from Darkseid. Around her, engineers she had trained in a single desperate week worked their consoles with the concentration of surgeons. Then Shuri activated the sequence. Across the field and above it, and in the tunnels beneath it, parademons paused. Their eyes, which had glowed with the amber compulsion of Apokolips, flickered. Some of them fell to their knees. Some of them wept in languages none of the Wakandans understood. Some of them turned upon their overseers with a fury that came not from programming but from the sudden, unbearable memory of who they had been before they had been taken. It was not all of them, it was not most of them, but it was enough to matter, and mattering was what Shuri had been trying to achieve. The battle broke open like a dam. Okoye led the Dora Milaje in a strike against Steppenwolf that would be studied in war academies across the galaxy for centuries afterward. She did not attempt to kill him alone. She attempted and succeeded in denying him the ground. Every step he took toward the united line cost him blood, and though he was a god of a lesser order, blood was blood, and enough of it eventually mattered. M'Baku and his Jabari smashed into the flank of a female Fury detachment with the raw joy of warriors who had waited too long to fight a war worth fighting. Freed parademons, still clumsy in their reclaimed selves, threw themselves into the line beside them, and one of them, a small creature with eyes that had not yet remembered how to weep, cut down two of its former handlers before being struck from behind. Above the battlefield, Wakandan Talon craft dueled Apokoliptian raiders in loops of fire that painted the low clouds with dying light. And T'Challa walked forward alone to meet Darkseid. He walked slowly. He had learned, from the enemy himself, the power of a slow approach. He carried in his hand not a weapon but the last of the heart-shaped herb, cupped in his palm as gently as if it were a living thing. He did not run. He did not shout. He walked. And every step he took toward the god who had broken his city was a step his people would remember for as long as their memory endured. Darkseid watched him come. When at last T'Challa stood before him, the god of Apokolips spoke, and his voice did not fill the air the way the voices of villains in stories often do. It settled upon the ground, quiet and reasonable, the voice of a teacher explaining an obvious lesson to a student who had chosen not to see it. "You have fought well," he said. "I honor that. Now stop." He raised the fragment. He offered the anti-life equation not as a threat but as an invitation. He described, in the calm tones of a man discussing weather, the world that would follow its acceptance. A world without hunger, because no one would want. A world without war, because no one would choose. A world without sorrow, because no one would remember. He spoke of an end to all the small, exhausting labors of consciousness. He spoke of peace. He meant it. That was, in the end, the most terrible thing about him. He truly believed he was offering a mercy. T'Challa listened. He did not interrupt. When Darkseid was finished, T'Challa answered, and his answer was the shortest speech any king of Wakanda had ever made upon a battlefield. "We would rather struggle," he said, "than be still." Then he closed his fist around the herb. He did not attack Darkseid. Attacks were what Darkseid expected. Instead, he pressed the herb to his own chest, over his heart, and opened himself to the ancestral plane one final time. Bast was waiting. She did not speak. She only nodded. The bond between the panther and the ancestors flared into a bright and terrible light. Through that light, T'Challa reached across the ruined ground and touched the fragment in Darkseid's palm. He did not seize it. He did not fight for it. He accepted it entirely into himself. The anti-life equation entered him. For a single unbearable instant he understood it. He understood the argument it made. He understood the peace it offered. He understood, with a clarity that would have broken any lesser soul, exactly why so many worlds had already surrendered. And then, with the whole of his will, he refused it. The ancestral bond, that unbroken line stretching back to the first panther, took the full weight of his refusal and channeled it outward, and in that channeling the bond itself burned. The fragment shattered. The ancestral plane collapsed inward like a star dying. Bast, in the last moment, smiled at him and was gone. Darkseid staggered back, not from pain, from something older than pain. He had lost. He had lost cleanly, and he had lost to a mortal, and the calculation of his long existence would never quite balance again. He looked at T'Challa for a long moment. Then, without a word, he opened a boom tube behind himself and stepped through it, and his armies followed him in a route that had no dignity left in it. The battlefield fell silent. Wakanda had won. The cost, however, walked forward in the shape of a king who could no longer feel his ancestors, and who understood at last what victory truly weighed. The rain came 3 days after the battle, and it came softly, as though the sky itself had grown tired of drama. It fell upon the ruined avenues of the Golden City in a slow, steady rhythm, washing ash into the gutters and dust from the shoulders of the dead. Survivors emerged from shelters they had begun to think of as tombs. They walked through streets they no longer recognized. They found neighbors they had believed lost, and they wept without speaking, because the vocabulary of that kind of joy had not yet been invented. T'Challa walked among them. He did not wear the panther habit. He wore a simple robe of the sort a farmer might wear, and he walked with the slight uncertainty of a man who had not yet grown accustomed to the silence within his own soul. The ancestral plane was closed to him now. When he tried to reach for the voices of his fathers, he found only the ordinary quiet of his own thoughts. It was, he had come to realize, a form of loneliness he had never quite known could exist. Yet he did not carry his loneliness as a wound. He carried it as a debt. His fathers had counseled him for years. Now it was his turn to counsel the living, alone, and he had decided that he would try to be worthy of the silence they had left behind. The Great Mound no longer sang. That was the first change the scientists confirmed, and the one that would change everything else. The Vibranium beneath it had ceased to renew itself. What existed in the vaults was now finite, a fixed inheritance rather than an endless gift. The metal remained. Its properties remained. But the strange living resonance that had once filled the mountain with quiet music had gone, and with it had gone the assumption of infinite prosperity that had underwritten Wakandan planning for 100 generations. Shuri stood at the mouth of the ruined excavation shaft and listened to the absence with the calm attention of a scientist meeting a new law of nature. She did not mourn. Morning would come later and would take, she suspected, the rest of her life. For now, she measured, she noted. She began, in the practical way that had always been her particular gift, to plan a kingdom that would live within its means. Across the plateau, foreign delegations began to arrive. They came bearing supplies, engineers, medicine. They came, some of them bearing apologies for the many years in which they had underestimated the small kingdom in the mountains. T'Challa received them with courtesy, but without illusion. He knew that some of them would grow greedy again when they saw the ruined mound. He knew that others would grow bold. He accepted their help anyway, because refusing help had never been the Wakandan way, and because a kingdom that had learned to open its gates could not now close them merely because it had bled. Among the delegations came something stranger. A small group of freed parademons, still hesitant in their new selves, approached the Wakandan borders with hands raised and heads bowed. They did not ask for asylum in the usual sense. They asked, in the halting speech they were relearning, whether they might be permitted to help rebuild. They said that they had been taken from many worlds, and that most of those worlds no longer existed, and that Wakanda was the first place in 100 years that had reminded any of them what a home was. T'Challa welcomed them personally. He offered them a valley in the eastern highlands where they might settle without fear. Some Wakandans opposed the decision. He listened to those objections with respect, and then he made the decision anyway, because he had learned in the ancestral plane, in his final conversation with Bast, that mercy withheld from the recently freed was mercy that would eventually be withheld from everyone. Okoye returned to the training grounds of the Dora Milaje within a week of the battle. She did not speak of what she had lost. She trained the new recruits harder than she had ever trained any before them. She was gentler with them, too, in the ways only she knew how to be gentle. She had understood in the days after the war that the discipline she taught was no longer merely a weapon, it was a promise. She intended to keep it. Baku returned to his mountains. Before he left, he stood with T'Challa upon the ruined steps of the palace, and the two men who had once been rivals and had become, without ever saying it aloud, something closer to brothers, exchanged a look that said everything neither of them would ever say. Then Baku went home, and his people welcomed him, and the Jabari began, in their private way, to fold the memory of Wakanda's stand into their own oldest songs. At the edge of known space, in observatories no Wakandan telescope could reach, other civilizations noted what had occurred. They did not speak of it aloud. They only recorded it. The kingdom that had refused a god. The mountain that had cracked rather than yielded. The king who had burned an ancestral covenant to save a fragile future. Word of these things travels, in the deep places where such words travel. Peace, T'Challa reflected on the anniversary of the battle, was not a state. It was not a possession. It was, and would always be, a choice that a people made together every morning for as long as they were willing to make it, and Wakanda, wounded but standing, had chosen again. Generations passed, as generations do. The scars upon the Great Mound softened beneath moss and rain. The names of those who had fallen in the war were carved into a long, low wall in the heart of the rebuilt city, and children who had not yet been born on the morning of the crimson sky grew up trailing their fingers along that wall on their way to school. They asked their parents about the strange marks. Their parents told them what had happened. Their parents' parents corrected the details. The story, as all great stories do, began to become several stories at once, and each of them, in its own way, was true. The name of the Black Panther traveled further than Wakanda's borders had ever permitted before. Traders carried it into distant systems along with the rare and now finite Vibranium they were licensed to sell. Scholars from 100 worlds came to study the ruined mound and left with more questions than they had arrived with. Poets, less concerned with accuracy, wrote verses in which T'Challa had personally struck Darkseid down with a blade of light. And though the poets were wrong in every particular, the spirit of their verses was not entirely a lie. Across the wider galaxy, in places where the name Wakanda had never been spoken, the story took on the shape that legends take when they no longer need their facts. On worlds that had long since surrendered to Apokolips, whispers began to spread that a small kingdom on a small blue planet had said no, and had made the saying stick. On worlds that were still free but afraid, the story arrived like a slow, steady candle in a long, cold room. Free will, the legend said, was not a luxury, it was a muscle. It grew stronger when used, and Wakanda had used it against a god. The Black Panther, in the telling and retelling of the tale, became less a king and more a symbol. He became the face that appeared, in dreams, to people who had never seen his face. He became the answer given to children who asked whether tyranny could be resisted. He became, in the quiet councils of civilizations preparing for their own hard choices, the argument that ended debate. T'Challa himself lived a long life, and then a longer memory. He died as kings should die, in his own bed, surrounded by those he loved. He was buried not in the royal necropolis, which had been ruined in the war, but in a simple grove near the Eastern Valley, where the freed parademons had first been permitted to settle. His grave was unmarked at his own request. His people knew where it was. That, he had said, was enough. Centuries passed. Long after Shuri's grandchildren had grown old and taught their own grandchildren, long after the last direct memory of the war had faded from any living mind, a young explorer of the mining tribe was mapping a caved passage far beneath the restored surface of the Great Mound. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was that most dangerous of scientific creatures, a person merely curious, and her scanner registered in a chamber no map had recorded, a fragment of vibranium the size of a walnut, pulsing softly with a frequency her instruments did not recognize. She reached for it before her training could stop her. She held it in her palm. It was warm. It was alive in a way that Wakandan vibranium had not been alive for many generations. And when she brought it up into the sunlight and looked at it under the sky her ancestors had once defended, it hummed softly, in a note that seemed almost to be answering something very far away, beyond the reach of any telescope, far beyond even the source wall itself, in a place where words are older than the languages that carry them. A presence stirred. It had watched Wakanda's stand. It had watched Darkseid's defeat. It had watched patiently through the long centuries that followed. It had waited for exactly this. A shard of what had been sealed had survived, not enough to remake the equation, enough only to remake a question. The presence, which had no name that any living being could pronounce, spoke a single sentence into the dark, and though no one heard it, the stars nearest it bent their lights slightly in response. The story was never about Darkseid, it said. It was about what the fragment awakened. The young explorer, unaware of any of this, tucked the small warm shard into a pouch at her belt and climbed back toward the surface, humming a lullaby her grandmother had taught her. Above her, the stars of Earth's sky burned in their familiar patterns, patient and beautiful, indifferent to and yet somehow attentive to the small blue world beneath them. Somewhere in the vast quiet between those stars, the next legend had already begun to move.